All right. Hello and welcome to week two, topic two for Management 301. We're going to be looking now at something that we're going to call the ethical and social environment of the firm in our conversations about the firm's environment or the organization's environment this week. Topics going to be covering include managerial ethics, contemporary ethical issues, you might call them in the business environment, or hot topics, hot ethical issues. This topic of corporate social responsibility, that often just called CSR, what does that involve? What is it? The relationship between CSR, the firm, and the government, and sort of where do legal obligations begin, end, and CSR activities begin, and some of the different approaches firms take to CSR, varying approaches that different firms have based on their strategy, their culture, and how they've decided they're going to address or not address this area. So, talking about ethics, starting off at the individual level, what are ethics? They're defined as one's beliefs about whether a behavior, action, or decision is right or wrong. It's about what is the right thing to do? What is the right way to conduct ourselves? People have ethics. Organizations do not have ethics. When we talk about an organization behaving unethically, or a firm is an unethical firm, of course, that firm is simply an organization comprised of people. We're talking about the people themselves acting ethically or unethically within that firm. Oftentimes, if a firm is perceived to be unethical, it has to do with perhaps the top management team and the culture, to return to that topic from last week, that it's inculcating in that firm. Of course, ethical behavior varies from person to person. There are people who most would agree are very ethical people, ranging then to people who most would agree are very unethical people. Maybe you have Mother Teresa at the ethical side and Hitler at the unethical side, and then everything in between, of course. Ethical behavior is that behavior that conforms to these ideas about right and wrong. Of course, there's a lot of variation there because one person's ethical behavior may not meet the ethical expectations of another, depending on their systems of values, which we'll talk about. An unethical behavior is that does not conform to generally accepted social norms. Most cultures have a taboo on stealing or committing murder, but then sort of as you get more towards topics about which there is less agreement, it becomes a bit more difficult. For example, some cultures consider it unethical to lend at interest. Islam, of course, being a prime example. And so they have a completely different system of banking and deposits versus the West that has no problem or hasn't for centuries had any issue with lending at interest. So there are subtleties to be looked at here. A little visual that we're going to talk through here. There are a few aspects to do with individual ethics. There's the ethics of the way the employees act towards the organization, things like stealing from work, shirking, lying about sick days, all those sorts of things, honesty, keeping company secrets in good faith. Then there's also the ethics of the way the firm treats its employees, hiring and firing conditions, dishonest, maybe observance of employee contracts or agreements, and the privacy and respect that the firm gives to its employees. And then there's sort of this dual aspect of the way the employees and the firm, or the employees as the firm, treat the other economic favors in their sphere of influence. All those individuals in the task environment we talked about last topic, the customers, the competitors. Do we steal our competitors' trade secrets? That's unethical. What do we do with our customer information? Do we treat our customers fairly? Do we treat our suppliers well? Are we a really big firm that maybe takes advantage of smaller suppliers in developing countries? That's an ethical issue that's come up with firms like Gap and Nike. How do they treat their suppliers in Bangladesh, for example? So and then we have gradations, gray areas in ethical ambiguities, they call them here. Is advertising, is this an ethical advertising campaign? Is it an unethical advertising campaign? If we say that Coca-Cola's, if you drink Coca-Cola, it's going to make you beautiful and attractive to the opposite sex. Is that really ethical, right? Some of these old ads that you see from the 70s and 80s, now we look at them and say, well, that's not on. That's a bit unethical. But at the time, somebody thought it was okay, right? There are advertising campaigns now that come out, and some of them are just panned broadly as unethical. Other ones, reasonable people may disagree, as you might say. So, there's how, as we said, there's how the organization treats its employees, how the employees treat the organization. Those are two sort of reciprocal aspects of individual ethics or managerial ethics. How the firm treats those in its task environment, and what you might call the responses of the firm and its managers to ethical situations. What are the standards of the individual managers? How does a manager respond to revelations of unethical behavior by their employees? How does the board respond to revelations of unethical behavior by the top management team? That's the question at Boeing, for example. Managers may be under a lot of pressure to act unethically if they're in a highly competitive industry. A great example of this is firms that are competing internationally in countries where it's acceptable to take bribes. I know we had a company in Canada, SNC-Lavalin, that was the subject of scandal because it was found that it had been giving bribes to foreign officials. That behavior was not ethical in the environment it was operating in. And oftentimes SNC-Lavalin and others will argue in their defense that they're competing with other firms, and if they don't give the bribe, they don't get the business. So does that justify it? These are all ethical responses, better or worse, that managers may make to the context they're working in. Of course, some organizations have cultures that are highly ethical, where everyone knows you do the right thing. Other organizations, there may be one of sort of a, come on, goody two shoes, nobody's perfect, or and I've worked in both environments myself as well, sort of dubious selling practices, dubious ways of treating competitors, etc., that are ingrained in the culture. Again, often that comes from the top management team and works its way down. So as managers, we have a responsibility to behave ethically and set the tone in our organization. It starts with top management. And there's a sense in which a firm's never going to do any better than the ethics of its top management team, because that will trickle down. You can't export what you don't have, in a sense. If a manager doesn't have an ethical pattern of behavior, it's going to be very hard for them to instill that in those around them. But there are, assuming an ethical top management team, there are ways to try and diffuse those ethics within the organization. Committees to examine or monitor ethical behavior, the behavior of the top management team, training, either preemptive training. I know as an employee of the state of Louisiana, as a professor here, I had to take training about sexual harassment training, or Title IX training, and how to treat people fairly and equally. So those are often the types of trainings that are rolled out preemptively to try and instill the values of the organization and ethical behavior in employees before the situations arise. Sometimes training might have to be responsive if it's dealing with an issue that's arisen. Perhaps there's been an issue with fraud and it's decided that, okay, we need to go back and re-examine this as a firm and put everyone through some training, or some training to do with discrimination or whatever. You see this in the paper all the time. Three options, if you like, for or tools in the toolbox for organizations wishing to instill a good system of ethics in their firm. The first one is having written ethics codes, sort of codified ethics. Often firms will have something broad like a values statement, but they'll often go even deeper and beyond the letter of the law, if you like. Everyone in a firm, of course, has to follow the law of the land, but firms may spell out sort of their own laws about how things are done and what is considered ethical and unethical behavior for that firm. There may be firms, for example, that, at a bank, you may have a firm that wishes to avoid any appearance of conflict of interest that may not be illegal, but in order to maintain even not even have the appearance of conflicts of interest, the firm may ask you to declare certain gifts or avoid accepting certain gifts. Maybe you're not allowed to accept those Saints tickets from a client or from a student if you're a professor, that sort of thing. So ethics codes that are specific to the organization and written down. There's the application of moral judgment. So there's that might just be managers making the right moral decisions, hiring people based on their ability to make good moral decisions. You will often find that sometimes you'll have even sort of these ethical tests or scenario tests that you have to do to get a job, to test the nature of your values and ethics and whether those are compatible with the ethics and values of your firm. And then there's this idea about maintaining justice as an organization. We'll talk about different aspects of what it calls organizational justice in a few minutes here. Yeah, so some deep dives here into how to exercise each of these management tools. If you're going to apply moral judgment, the first thing you need to do is get the right information. This assumes you're sort of making a decision. So what are the facts about this decision? Perhaps it's a conflict between two employees, or it's a deal or an advertising campaign that you're not sure about. So get the information, determine the value set that is applicable to this. So what's the issue? Is it an issue about body image and you're selling sort of makeup or clothing, and you want to determine what the values are that you believe are the most ethical, and then make your decision based on that information and the values that you wish to apply to that decision. Here's on the right side here, we have some sort of classical philosophical approaches to ethics, going all the way back to Aristotle, of course, and the Greeks, who would ponder what is the right way to live and what are the right ethics that someone should demonstrate. Utility is one. Does it optimize? Is it a win-win? Does it create the best outcome for the most people? That's the utilitarian perspective. Rights, does it respect people's rights? That's usually sort of a bare minimum. Does it violate anyone's rights as individuals? Is it just? Is it fair to both parties? Sometimes decisions are based on fairness. Does it give maybe the most equal outcome, or they're based on rights? Does it violate anyone's? Those can be in conflict sometimes. Anybody who's ever said life isn't fair to a child knows that sometimes what's right isn't necessarily a fair distribution. Caring, that can be another ethical principle upon which to make a decision. Does this give the most care to everyone involved? And again, what's the most caring for your employees may not always be what's the most right for your customers, or vice versa. So oftentimes firms will try and balance all of these principles, and as people, we try to balance these principles to make the most ethical decision we can. But it's good to examine which principles are coming into play here and which ones maybe we're prioritizing. Maybe some people prioritize caring maybe more than justice or rights. Some may prioritize utility. Do the most people get the most out of this decision, even if for a small minority of people, it's not terribly caring. That's the utility one probably has the most dubious history in terms of making some or possibly justifying some not very good decisions. If you want to, these are the same people who oftentimes were part of the eugenics movement, going back historically, right? Sure, you can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs. That's sort of the utilitarian argument. Good. So what's involved in this concept of organizational justice? It's argued that there's four basic forms. There's distributive justice, procedural justice, interpersonal justice, and what's called informational justice. And these are all things that people can see in an organization and evaluate how they form opinions about the justice of that organization along each of these aspects. Distributive justice is, as it implies, are we all getting a fair share? Some societies or some firms may put quite a high premium on distributive justice. Costco, there's quotes from the Costco CEO, essentially to the fact that he doesn't want to have different firms will accept different degrees of inequality between the top salary and the smallest salary. And I think there's even countries that will stipulate what the maximum difference can be. How many times is the CEO's salary allowed to be of the lowest paid employee? Some firms prefer to have less difference and more distributive justice. Everybody's paid closer to the same. Some firms aren't as concerned about distributive justice, and maybe they'd say they're more interested in procedural justice. Everyone has the same opportunities, but not everyone is rewarded in the same way. Procedural justice is the perception of the fairness used to determine outcomes. Maybe we don't pay everyone the same amount as or in the same way. Unions, for example, the longer you're there, the more you make. Procedural justice, though, maybe it's not the longer you're there, the more you make, but is it a fair evaluation procedure at the end of the year when we evaluate your performance and give out bonuses? Is that procedure viewed as being fair, as just? Interpersonal justice, that's probably the kind we feel the most, or that's the most obvious when someone is treating us unfairly. Is our boss treating us unfairly? Do we feel like our boss is giving this person a better shake than they're giving us? That has to do with interpersonal justice. My work isn't appreciated. I'm given more. I have a higher burden than maybe the person I work with, and maybe I think this person's a favorite and I'm not, or whatever. Informational justice. Do we know how a decision was made? Have I been terminated and I don't even know why? That would be a situation where I perceived it to be low informational justice in that case. So here we have sort of a process chart that for making ethical decisions that who knows, maybe you end up in a situation and you decide, oh my gosh, what do I do? I'm going to look back to Management 301 and pull out that ethical decision-making chart. So first step, make sure you actually know what's going on, gather all the facts. If it's something that happened, make sure you know what happened, get all the details from both parties or whatever. Figure out what the policy is of your firm or the law is about that act then as well. And then use one or more of these principles. Maybe the nature of it is, well, is it the best for all parties involved? Does it get the best outcome? Parents are often utilitarian. What's going to make everyone happy and just keep the peace? Does it respect the rights? Is it a justice issue? Is it a caring issue? Which of these ethical principles do I want to base my decision on? Maybe it can be the best along all dimensions, right? Is it yes on all criteria? Easy. The policy is ethical. The decision is ethical. Is it no on all criteria? Probably then it's not. If there's no ethical principle upon which you can justify this decision, it's probably not an ethical decision. And then most of them tend to fall in that middle group there that makes it a difficult decision. And okay, well, is any one of these principles more important in this case? Is there any one of these principles that is violated so egregiously that is it, maybe it's like that utilitarian. It produces the best outcome, but we have to throw a baby under the bus to achieve it. Well, then no matter how much utility we get, that violates the rights of that child so much, we're just not going to do it. So are there any other factors to consider, right? And then we end up somewhere between no and yes based on a balancing act of all those principles. Ethical leadership. What are some trends in ethical leadership that are prominent on the manager's horizon these days? The Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, sometimes called SOX, was quite a wide-ranging piece of legislation addressing CEOs and CFOs and their behavior. I think it might have been related to the Enron scandal, but I'd have to double check that, so don't quote me on it. But essentially, that act made it CEOs and CFOs makes them personally vouch for the truthfulness of their firm's financial disclosures. This actually works. There's a lot of it doesn't work in every instance, but it improves the situation. There's a lot of evidence out there that if someone has to sign their name to a statement, they're quite a bit less likely to violate whatever they've signed their name to, which is encouraging, I hope. The discouraging part of that is it's certainly not 100% of people won't violate it, but more than will if they aren't required to sign anything. So even teachers will often have students sign a code of ethics because it does reduce things like cheating, etc. So that act required CEOs and CFOs to sign off on the corporate statements, as you'll see if you look at a 10K. I, the CEO of this company, Elon Musk, or the CFO, vouch for the truthfulness and fairness of our financial information in our 10K report for 2023. There's also been a lot of focus on corporate governance. Boards of directors have to be independent. They need to avoid colluding, obviously, with the management teams that they're managing or governing. And so there's been a lot of effort to really improve the both the independence of boards and maybe the monitoring responsibilities of boards. It's not enough just to sit back and collect a paycheck for being a board member. We're going to put you on the hook even for what your top management team does, and hold you responsible if you're overlooking unethical behavior or just not doing enough to prevent it. So a lot of talk about corporate governance and the role of corporate governance in monitoring these rogue CEOs in the last 20 years. Information technology is another big area of discussion when it comes to business ethics. Your information is out there. There's been, of course, some famous data. These weren't even data breaches. They were legitimate or authorized uses of data. For example, Facebook selling customer data to, was it Oxford Analytics, something like that, or Cambridge Analytics, some marketing firm that just bought a bunch of Facebook user data without the knowledge of Facebook customers. And those sorts of decisions are being increasingly subject to scrutiny and ethical scrutiny. You have to, every firm you do business with now knows everything about you, has all your pictures, has all your videos. What are they allowed to do with that? What's ethical, what's not ethical? And this idea that, even though you're signing something, what are you signing? And is it ethical to even require people to sign for a service that you can't get away without using, perhaps? So yeah, a lot of ink being spilled and a lot of thought being devoted to who owns your Google searches, who owns your Facebook profile and your pictures. In theory, it's the companies that are providing the service. You essentially sign something saying they do own that, but what can they do with that data? Big consideration. We're not going to go a ton into that here, but if you find yourself in a position where you're making those decisions, please refer to our flow chart there about how to make ethical decisions. Then we talk about something called social responsibility as our next topic, corporate social responsibility, or CSR. Defined here as the set of obligations that an organization has to protect and enhance the societal context in which it functions. Now, this set of obligations, what's in that set is the part that's really up for some debate and disagreement, depending on what views you hold. A couple key terms here are what's called a stakeholder. This is someone who has an interest in the operations of your firm. This can really range from a fairly tenuous stakeholder, someone who's angry on Twitter about your political opinions, I would say is a pretty tenuous stakeholder, to someone who has a much more legitimate claim on your firm. Obviously, the shareholders, everybody knows they're an important stakeholder. They own the firm, they own the assets, they've invested their money. The customers are also a very important stakeholder. They're the one who are buying the service. They have legal standing and legal rights as related to their position as stakeholders. Employees, also really important stakeholders. Suppliers, really important stakeholder. They're very interested in how you treat them and the fortunes of your business and the decisions you make. If you decide to move your auto plant from Michigan to Mexico, you might have local suppliers that are disappointed whether or not they have any right to say anything about that, or maybe context specific. Maybe you've had a long relationship with them and you've incurred some moral obligations, who knows, unwritten or informal moral obligations to a greater or lesser extent, let alone legal obligations. There's the natural environment. That's an area of social concern, of course. If we dump a bunch of poison into the local creek, that is not very socially responsible, and of course, probably illegal. On the more ambiguous and difficult to manage side, what are firms' responsibilities regarding climate change? Are we responsible just for our own pollution? Are we responsible for the end user's pollution? If I make Ford vehicles, am I responsible for how much the owners of my purchases of my vehicles pollute? And then this idea of general social welfare, the whole country? How does it increase the prosperity of the country? Does it increase the well-being of everyone? Getting fairly broad now here in terms of social responsibility. Um, as it says here, so we've got all our stakeholders listed here in a big wheel. I'm sure you could think of other ones as well, interest groups, colleges and universities, student protests, all sorts of things. But the three most important ones, as outlined here, are your customers, your employees, and your investors. I might add your suppliers to that. They can be pretty darn important in terms of your relationship with them because you can't do business without them. You're their customers, if you like. So that's kind of the other side of that customer relationship. Who am I the customer of? These are important stakeholders that firms tend to focus on. Every firm focuses on them as a bare minimum. If you're not focusing on your employees, they're going to leave. If you're not focusing on your customers, they're going to go somewhere else. And if you're not focusing on your investors, they're going to fire you if you're the manager. So areas of concern, the natural environment. Obviously, there's legislation about how firms operate and treat waste, address issues of climate change and sustainability, etc. General social welfare responsibilities are often addressed through things like philanthropy. My daughter plays softball here. She's sponsored by Academy Sports. The other team's sponsored by Off the Hook. These are philanthropic, voluntary philanthropic activities. Sometimes politicians will impose philanthropic activities as part of a license or a contract, right? To say, if you want to build XYZ plant here, we'll only give you a license if you promise to build some schools, or maybe you're building in a third world country, developing country, and you agree to build roads or something like that. That's often an imposed obligation rather than maybe a strictly voluntary one. There's arguments for so corporate social responsibility is a hot topic and somewhat contested because there's arguments for and against. Of course, everybody. It sounds very nice to do nice things and give money to philanthropic activities, but then even there you start to run into the problem of, well, whose philanthropic activities are we going to give to? Maybe I'm the CEO and I really like to be invited to the Met Gala, so I'm going to give a lot of money to the arts in this area and try to make a name for myself as a great giver. And of course, it's not the CEO's money, it's the shareholders' money. And that's the big argument really against it, is the idea that, well, when CEOs and firms that are publicly held make these gifts or engage in corporate social responsibility beyond what's required by the law, they are choosing to commit the resources that they do not own to a cause they might enjoy. So when a CEO chooses to give on behalf of Apple a bunch of money, it's not his money. Essentially, it may still be the right thing to do, maybe a good decision, but that money could have gone to the shareholders. So on one side, you have this idea that, well, it's not your money, it's our money, it's the shareholders' money, give it to the shareholders. And if they want to make philanthropic gifts with that money, they can do it themselves. It also involves firms in providing social services, which even what you might say more left-leaning, big state individuals who still believe that these services should be provided, they might say, well, no, it should be provided by the government, not by these private companies. Right? Maybe the teachers union says, well, why is this company setting up its own school? That's our job, right? It shouldn't be given to this private company. It should be part of the democratic process. So there's possible conflicts of interest as well. Who do we give the money to? Also, there's the whole fact that what does a CEO know about improving the social welfare, right? Stick to your knitting. You get paid to make those pharmaceuticals, and let someone else, if you want to give part of your salary to a philanthropic organization, do that, and they'll see to the social mission, and they'll be better at it than you are. Another argument obviously would be, well, we pay taxes to look after these social issues. The firm pays taxes. Everything. If you want to be doing more social good, either raise the taxes or get out of here. So that's the arguments against. The arguments for are kind of obvious, right? You're a big firm, you're Amazon, you have a lot of money, you're a big footprint in the community, you should be using that to benefit the community. Seems reasonable. If you're creating, there's a difference here, I think, between maybe what is just good behavior and what goes beyond that that maybe isn't being highlighted. Businesses create the problems and should help solve them. That's kind of obvious. If you polluted the river, you should probably help fix the river. Um, Less obvious is if you're a auto manufacturer, you should sponsor the local sports team. That's not as you didn't cause a problem that needs to be fixed there. It's a question about doing something a little bit more undirectly related to your business activities. A few different approaches to social responsibility as defined sort of in the literature. You have what they call the obstructionist stance. I don't want to do social responsibility. I don't want to know about it. I'm going to do as little as possible so I can just get away with it and stay on the good side of legal. You have a defensive stance, which is, okay, I'm going to do what's legal and nothing more. So your obstructionist stance is, I'm probably also doing stuff that's illegal and I hope I don't get caught. Right? It's only wrong if we get caught would be the obstructionist stance. Surprisingly common stance. We see it in the newspaper all the time, right? Boeing, if they're not sorry till they get caught, but it's going on. If we can avoid getting caught, the Volkswagen emissions scandal, same thing. As long as we don't get caught, hey, we're good. The defensive stance, no, we're going to do what's legally required, but nothing more. We're not going to go beyond the letter of the law. The accommodative stance, we meet the letter of the law and we're sometimes going to go beyond. I'd say this is probably where most firms operate is, yeah, we're gonna abide by the law, and maybe we sponsor this local softball team or we give to charity, something like that. And then you have what's called the proactive stance. These are sort of almost activist corporations. They're gonna, I mean, it's in the word, it's proactive. They're gonna get out, they're gonna and seek opportunities to contribute. Sort of a very high commitment to CSR as a firm. Maybe they have a whole part of the firm that's devoted to CSR. Very common among big firms. So you have those sort of plotted out here from the least commitment to the most in terms of social responsibility, with our obstructionist firm here probably breaking the law when they can get away with it until they get caught, and proactive, they're in theory observing the letter of the law and they're out doing as much good as they can, presumably while still staying profitable, because if they're not, they saying is no margin, no mission. You can't be giving to charity if you're not at least covering your expenses and paying your employees. Interesting relationship when we talk about responsibility between the government and the businesses it governs. Government, of course, influences the business environment with legislation to do with the environment, with consumers, to protect the employees, to protect investors through securities legislation, and to help with the general good, as we discussed, through tax, right? They tax the organization and then use those tax dollars in theory towards the general welfare. So that's a way that the government seeks to derive these social responsibility obligations from the firm. But the firm, of course, is also then trying to influence the politicians in government to maybe go easy on them or structure things in a way that is beneficial to that company. And they do that through things like personal contacts, right? There's these guys are, I say these guys, I'm not in their circles, maybe one day, but the CEO of a big company probably knows the senator and the governor of his state. And they hang out in the same networks. Maybe their kids go to the same school. So there's just the fact that they're often in the same social circles, and the influence sort of informally that way. You drop a comment at the dinner party, oh, I don't know about that tax bill that you've proposed. There might be explicit lobbying where you hire lobbyists, like the NRA is a very famous lobby. Maybe oil, we had a very well-known Canadian oil producers lobby in Canada that would lobby the government sort of to propose or to introduce favorable legislation for oil and gas producers. Almost every industry has this. The farmers have very successful lobbies. Or maybe there's maybe political action committees, right? You donate to a PAC or a super PAC, they're sometimes called now when they're really big, to try and get the candidate you want elected. And in the news right now, I think the most well-known is Elon Musk has been donating to a PAC to get Donald Trump elected. So that's one way to influence, that business can influence the government. And depending on who your party is, you're always angry about the other party's PACs and who's donating to them, and you think it's unethical, but whoever donates to your party that's fine, of course, right? And then there's more dubious favors and other tactics. Maybe you invite that senator out to a football game, or you take him on a cruise, or you do something that maybe starts to look a little bit more like a bribe, or maybe you're blackmailing them or influencing them some other way. Maybe you're making threats to leave the state or whatever. But all that to say, the government influences business, business influences the government, and it's either a virtuous or a vicious circle, however you want to look at it, or sometimes one or the other. Good, we've covered all these. Formal ways that organizations act responsibly. Legal compliance, right? You're either following the law or you're not. Ethical compliance, you're either making ethical decisions or you're not, or maybe you've codified those and you have ethics committees. Universities always have ethics committees because of these horrible experiments that universities did back in the 60s and 50s and otherwise. So anytime a researcher wants to do some research, there's going to be an ethics committee to make a decision about whether or not this is ethical. Philanthropical giving is obviously very formalized as well. You're going to get a receipt, you're going to make a tax statement. These are all formal ways or formal actions that can be responsible or not. More informally would be things like the leadership of the organization. Are they known as, are the managers known as ethical people? Are they instilling ethical values through their everyday actions and the way that they talk and the way they set the tone? And whistleblowing. Whistleblowing is slightly more informal. Are employees allowed to disclose unethical behavior that they witness? If you see your manager doing something they shouldn't be doing, how free are you to whistleblow? Can we go and raise the alarm, if you like? Again, this is something that was happening at Boeing quite a bit. There were whistleblowers saying, "Hey, something's going wrong here with what's happening." Is there a structure to do that? This says this is informal. A firm may have actually a very formal whistleblower procedure, in which case it would be a formal action. Good. All right. So much. And then how do we evaluate? How do we see how we're doing? If we're going to do corporate social responsibility, and we've decided that's something that's important to us, how do we measure performance? If somebody's getting paid to devote the firm's resources, if we have a CSR director or something like that, how are we going to measure it? Firms might choose to even audit their CSR of their firm. There's third-party organizations that will evaluate firms on how they're doing, whether they like it or not, whether or not they're trying to do anything to say with their diversity initiatives, their environmental initiatives, etc. And it's quite easy to go and Google, how is this firm doing in terms of environmental initiatives or diversity initiatives, or any other dimension of ethical behavior that you'd like. Apparently, 93% of the world's 250 largest firms issue reports, and a lot of publicly traded firms now, especially the big ones, will have some statement about their environmental and CSR efforts. Their investors want it. They're in the news all the time because they're the biggest companies, so they're kind of a target. Most activists aren't going to go and boycott the local shrimp company because of their environmental policies. It's, no pun intended, it's not a very big fish. It's not a very big catch, right? They got bigger fish to fry. But also these firms, they aren't just big and attention in the limelight, but they also have the resources to do this. If you're Amazon, you have resources to devote to CSR in a way that someone running a local po' boy shop in Louisiana doesn't have. They don't have the time, the capacity to go and maybe create a report about their initiatives in the same way. So there's kind of two sides to why those firms, those big publicly traded firms, are doing these things. Good. All right. That is all for this lecture. I will see you in topic 3 for this week, coming right up.